Right, I think we'll start. Good evening, everybody. My name's Paul Anticoni. I'm the Chief Executive of World Jewish Relief, and it's lovely to have you with us for this evening's entertainment. A very warm welcome in all senses of the word. Certainly in London, it's a scorching 30 degrees. And welcome to tonight's fascinating event hosted by our Connections Committee in conjunction with World Jewish Relief. We have 180 callers on the call already. We know there are multiple families within that. I estimate there are 300 people plus, and a warm welcome certainly to viewers joining us from Israel, from Poland, from the US, and obviously all over the UK. For 30 years, our wonderful Connections Committee has been supporting Jewish students from challenging backgrounds in Central and Eastern Europe with stipends to support their studies and career progression, keeping them engaged and connected to their Jewish community. Led by Linda Rosenblatt and Jean Marks, this incredible group of women has transformed the lives of hundreds of capable students. But they are also event organisers extraordinaire, and we thank them enormously for putting together our entertainment this evening. Tonight's event is in support of World Jewish Relief's international COVID-19 appeal. The pandemic, as all of you know, has now reached essentially every country in the world. It has upended health systems and brought economies and societies to a almost complete standstill. Its most devastating and destabilizing effects are being felt in the world's poorest and most fragile countries, places where poverty and hunger are already present and healthcare systems already under-resourced and overstretched. We may feel that we're just about emerging from this disaster, but the most fragile places on earth, I promise you, are still set to see the peak of the disease in the next 2 to 5 months. It still has the potential to be catastrophic in the developing world. And we also now face the biggest economic slowdown in living memory. These effects will be felt most sharply in countries where World Jewish Relief works in. Our COVID-19 appeal now seeks to ensure that we can mitigate the impact of this virus on our elderly Jewish clients in Eastern Europe, as well as assisting the thousands of those in our community who have now lost jobs, lost their work, and lost a source of income and need our assistance. The provision of PPE, food parcels, medical support, hygiene will save lives today and tomorrow. If we don't support them, sadly, nobody else will. And of course, World Jewish Relief remains committed to also supporting those beyond the Jewish community, those who find themselves in horrific refugee contexts, particularly the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, as well as those trying desperately to recover from disasters in Myanmar, Mozambique, and Haiti. We cannot stop the disease, but we can certainly play a part in reducing its impact. To support our appeal, you'll see details in the chat box, which is listed just at the bottom of your screen. But you could also simply go to our website, www.worldjewishrelief.org. Thank you. We really welcome your support. So now let me introduce our 2 star guests, both of whom we are lucky to call as close friends of World Jewish Relief and ambassadors of our proud community. We're delighted to have with us this evening Emily Maitlis, journalist, newsreader, presenter of Newsnight, and fellow journalist and broadcaster Jonathan Freedland, chatting about Jonathan's latest blockbuster thriller, To Kill a Man. I'm now going to hand over to Emily to take us through this evening. Thank you. Bear with us while we change screens.
Hello and thank you. Thanks, Paul, and thank you all for joining us. Are we in vision now? Shall I wait for the thumbs up, or shall I assume that we're good to go?
I can see you, Emily, and you can see me. So
Perfect.
I think we should think we're good to go.
And this is who I'm talking to tonight. I'm talking to both Jonathan Freedland and Sam Bourne. And I have to be honest that as a TV journalist, my main difficulty with Sam Bourne fiction is that I present Newsnight and then I go to sleep reading a chapter or two. And by the time I've woken up, I can no longer remember the stuff that I was reporting on the news and the stuff that Jonathan has written, Sam Bourne has written, that comes so perilously, dangerously, tantalizingly close to the themes and the questions that are keeping all of us awake in the world of news at night. And this one is a thriller from page one. It begins with a brutal attack, an assassination, and the perpetrator, straight from Jonathan's world and my world perhaps, is none other than, you've guessed it, a putative presidential candidate, and her name is Natasha. And Jonathan, I guess it feels like this one was written in the shadow of the Me Too movement. What were the things that you most wanted to grapple with in this one?
Well, hi, Emily, and hello, everyone who's watching. Very good to be with you on this very warm evening. It's a great pleasure to be here. In a way, with these books, they have to begin not with, an issue or a question I want to grapple with, but a story. And because, if it's going to be a sort of issue, then I'll turn to my day job as a writer of columns and do that there. The first thought really has to be a story. And in this case, it was a nugget I'd read long before anyone had talked about Me Too, actually. It was a news story, barely reported here, which was simply that a woman had been attacked in her own home. She had defended herself from her attacker and killed the attacker in self-defense. And later, the police had discovered that this wasn't just any random intruder into her home. It turned out, in this case, in America, the man who she'd killed, who was lying dead in her kitchen, was a wanted serial killer. And so she was told by the police, you've taken out this guy who's terrorized women for years. And it's just struck me as being an amazing sort of bit of drama, that what if somebody was attacked in their own home and defended themselves and discovered that had been the outcome. And so in this case, this is, as you mentioned, putative presidential candidate, hotshot lawyer in her 30s, who is attacked in her own home, defends herself, leaves the attacker dead, and within a chapter or two, it becomes clear it's not just any old attacker who's there. And so really it began with that story, what if that happened? And with all these books, there has to be a what if. And, with To Kill the President, the what if was not that far from reality, which was what if a completely sort of unhinged man was in the Oval Office? How would the people around him deal with that? And then with this one, the what if was that. How would the world react to a high-profile woman who was attacked and defended herself? And I was just very interested in the idea that I thought a woman like that in that situation would actually end up getting a lot of allies and support from left and from right, and it would go in quite interesting directions. So that was the starting point for this book.
It's so interesting because the public perception is quite a big theme of this, or a big part of it. You focus group, we get Natasha Winthrop's primary competitor, opponent, and you really get a sense of the audience or the reader watching to see whether the public's with her or against her, and how closely that flips. Is that your personal fascination? Just what moves the public, what moves our behavior?
Yes, I mean, as journalists, both of us, we are all the time trying to sort of keep our finger on the pulse and see how the mood is developing. And before, there were other ways of doing that, including polling and vox pops on the streets. Now with social media, you can see it happen in real time. And that was one of the things I wanted to convey in the book, is how fickle the mood is. So in the first wave, there's all this hashtag I stand with Natasha. And that was partly because I thought feminists and people on the left would stand with her. She's a figure on the left. She's a kind of human rights lawyer who has been this inquisitor in televised hearings. The book never tells you what the hearings were, but I think you might think they were impeachment hearings or something like it. And so she's developed a bit of a cult following on the left. And then on the right, I was thinking about Tony Martin, the farmer in Norfolk, maybe it was 20 years ago, who, there was an intruder in his home and he shot him dead. And, in the Telegraph universe, they loved him, they hailed him for self-defense and for defending an Englishman's home is his castle. In America, because of Second Amendment gun rights, I figured they would definitely support a woman who had defended herself. You know, in the book, it's not with a gun, but I thought for that moment she would have left and right on her side. But then, as inconsistencies appeared in her story, and as it emerged that maybe it wasn't quite as simple as it first looked, and that perhaps she hadn't been giving everyone the whole story, I imagined then, you know, bits of that support flaking away, and some people who had previously said hashtag I stand with Natasha, you know, quietly deleting those tweets. So I wanted all of that in there because the ebbs and flows of public opinion are a big part of the story, and a big part of the, you know, what the heroine of the story, which is in some ways not Natasha, but Maggie Costello, who's been a figure in 4 or 5 Sam Bourne books now, that she would come on the scene and think, how do I deal with, you know, I've been called in to help this woman who I believe in and think is really admirable politically. You know, how am I going to navigate by finding out whether or not she is really telling the truth of this story or if there's more to it?
I think this was the one where we learned that she actually calls herself Costello, isn't it?
That's right.
With the emphasis on the first bit. I love
That's right.
Before we get carried away, I should just say that Jonathan and I are going to be chatting about the book and more widely about politics and America and what's coming up. But we're leaving room at the end at about sort of 15:15 or so to take your questions. And if I am the technological genius that I'm hoping to be, I'll be able to read out some of your questions and put them straight to Jonathan. You do seem to enjoy your female characters. They are sassy and funny and strong and vulnerable as well. But I wonder if is there a nervousness as a man sort of writing the sort of inside the female brain?
Well, with this book, there was some nervousness because, and we haven't got massively into it yet, but you know, there is a whole subject about violence against women in this book. And there are a few scenes that I know are really hard to take for a lot of readers. And those, I was really careful about those. So I spoke to a whole lot of women who are, you know, who work in this field. I showed the relevant bits to, you know, women readers who would have a keen eye for that material. I really wanted to get that right and not get that wrong, and for it not even to be, okay, technically right, but a bit sort of icky. And I'm, you know, and it went through 4 or 5 reads from different women to make sure of that. In terms of the character herself, I have now grown extremely comfortable writing Maggie Costello, and feel, you know, the editors I've had have always been women for these books. So I think if I am getting it wrong, they would tell me. But the truth is, ever since I've started writing her, the problems I had with the, you know, protagonist have been much less than I had before, because the first book I wrote, The Righteous Men, the main protagonist was a man, a journalist, a British journalist in America, and people who liked the book afterwards said, you know, I really liked everything about the book, but I'm not sure really about him. And the reason is that I think in a way he was a bit too much like me. And the advice from the publishers and the editor afterwards was, you need to, you know, whatever you do, make sure the next hero is just very different from you. And so very naturally the choice was, well, if the main character is a woman, automatically she's not me. And somehow that freed up something.
Is Sam meant to be androgynous? Was that, do you think that you're writing possibly as a woman or possibly as a man, or am I reading too much into that?
No, you're not. I mean, you know, long before anyone talked about non-binary, the ambiguity of that is very helpful. And that is not the reason we chose the name. So in a nutshell, I had the idea of the very first thriller, The Righteous Men. I showed the idea to my agent, very old friend, Johnny Geller, who loved the idea and said, great idea. The only problem is your name. And I said, what's wrong with my name? I quite like my name. And he said, your name sounds like a pointy-headed writer for a pointy-headed newspaper. It's not a thriller writer's name. You've got to come up with something else. And it was an automatic decision for me that the name would be Sam, the first name, because I had written a memoir, not really a memoir, a biography really, of 3 members of my own family, a book called Jacob's Gift. And that was because my first child was called Jacob. And so he had his name on the cover of a book, and lots of, you know, well-meaning friends and relatives said, I worry when your next child, who was born once the book was published, Sam, we worry that he's going to grow up feeling very jealous of his brother having the name on a cover of a book. You're going to have to do something for him. And so once we needed to come up with a pseudonym, it was very obviously it would have to be Sam something. And that did have the benefit of being gender neutral, because one of the big things in the thriller writing world is the ideal thriller writer's name is monosyllables. So, Lee Child, Dan Brown. You want to be in the top half of the alphabet, because books are stored in shops alphabetically A to Z, and you want to be at eye level. So B is very good, and really good is if you can have a first name that could be male or female, hence Lee Child. And that's because thrillers are the one genre that are read equally by men and women. Almost all fiction is read overwhelmingly by women, but the one genre that has both men and women is thrillers. And so therefore, without realizing it, because my second son is called Sam, we lucked out with a gender ambiguous first name.
That's fascinating.
More detail than you wanted, probably.
No, well, I'm going to pry actually and say, when you did your first drafts, and as you say, you touch upon really sensitive subjects here, which is sexual abuse, domestic abuse. Did they tell you, did your editors and did your friendly readers tell you were getting things wrong? Did you correct things, or did you seem to come away from that, with a thumbs up?
It was mainly a thumbs up, but there were a few things that were changed, and mainly where it was seen to be too much. There are those scenes of violence, and as there is violence against women, but there is also violence against men, even sexual violence against men. And a couple of readers felt that was just too difficult on the stomach to take, and I toned it down. And then there was a really interesting debate, and I mentioned, she's credited, so I can mention her, Julie Bindel, who's really, her specialist field is domestic violence and sexual violence against women. And we got into this really interesting debate between her and another reader, about whether it was feminist or not for a woman to imagine to even sort of want to, at the level of a fantasy, to get retribution against men in kind. And was that a feminist aspiration or not? And in a way, the very fact that the other reader, who was just as feminist as she was, had a different view, the fact it was an argument made me think, I'm going to go with it because it's interesting. The argument they're having was interesting. And in a way, the most you can hope for with books like this, and some of my books have been read in book groups, and I've heard afterwards about the conversations. What most people really want is discussion and argument. And so I've kept some of that in, even though I knew, there were points of sort of contest there.
You mentioned Tony Martin and a very specific newspaper article that had sort of triggered this particular narrative or plot. I'm wondering if there were other real life events that were circling at the time, or whether it was all written by the time that Weinstein came out, that Christine Blasey Ford, she was very much in my head at the time. Our viewers will remember her as the woman who came to testify against Brett Kavanaugh when he was becoming admitted to the Supreme Court in the US. And I just wondered whether there were sort of areas that you were taking from their testimony, because the painful bit is always about being believed, isn't it? That's a very, very central part of what you describe. I guess it goes back to the public perception and the hashtags, but fundamentally, are the women who tell their stories believed? That's
completely right. And one of my rules with a lot of these books is what I'm now calling the Margaret Atwood rule. One of the most powerful takeaways from The Handmaid's Tale is that every egregious act of misogyny and oppression of women in The Handmaid's Tale was happening somewhere in the world when Margaret Atwood wrote that book. So that the public hangings that's in there was going on in Saudi Arabia and in Iran, and she made sure that nobody could say, well, nothing like that would ever happen. And that has guided me a lot with this life of writing these thrillers. I do make sure that most of the things, however outlandish, are usually anchored in the reality somewhere, so that people don't actually are not able to say, well, that would never happen. And so you're absolutely right. There is a whole Me Too theme in the book. There are these, we don't want to give away the story, but there are episodes from around the world involving those sorts of episodes of abuse and harassment. And I steeped myself in a whole lot of those first person accounts by victims to make sure that what I was describing was how these things happen, rather than how I imagine them happening as a man. And sure enough, that one, there was just, and it's brilliant you picked up on it, there was one particular detail that Christine Blasey Ford said, and I'm sure a lot of people remember it. It was really, of all the harrowing things she said, she described how when she was being, pinned down on this bed, there was the abuser's friend was laughing at the time. And I wanted to have that in there somewhere, because that's exactly one of the things that comes through in all that you read these testimonies, is this horrible physical mistreatment often, but it's those sorts of psychological humiliations that last. And, there's one episode which, for example, there's somebody who works in a restaurant and the chef humiliates one of the women who work for him. And it's funny how this hasn't got a lot of attention here. Up there with politicians and film executives and TV hosts in America were a huge number of really high profile chefs were caught in the Me Too phenomenon. And I don't know whether we had any of the equivalent of those here. Maybe we did, but there were several in the United States. And I read some of those about, waitresses and cooks who had been humiliated by these sort of larger than life restaurant supremos. Any one of these fields where there's a really dominant alpha male, it seems to be that this was a pattern. And yeah, so in answer to your question, absolutely, I had those real life episodes in my mind, and I was doing most of the writing of this book last year, and therefore those things had happened.
Yeah, and the political context is never far from the central plot. Natasha, we don't know, she may or may not stand for president, but we see this through the eyes of the focus group. And I wonder how much this whole political year is feeding into that, or whether, Natasha is not Hillary Clinton. She's definitely not Joe Biden. I don't know if she's sort of based loosely on one of the candidates that you were sort of watching or admiring, or whether she's just a complete fiction, but in a very interesting political year.
She is really a fiction. There are elements of real people I've known who go to make up her, but the idea of her was somebody who would have been completely impossible, even at the level of a thriller writer, until Trump. Now, why do I say that? Because she's obviously nothing like Trump. She's highly educated. She's mid-30s. She is sort of dazzlingly clever lawyer. She is the un-Trump. The reason why I mentioned Trump is that until him, if you were writing political thrillers, then possible presidents had to be politicians. They had to be governors and senators and people in their, 50s and 60s who'd been around the clock. And so indeed, her rival is a kind of Biden-like senator who's been around forever. But what Trump has done is he's made it possible that people who are complete novices, who have never run for elective office ever, but have done really well on TV, that is now plausible. No one can pick this book up and say, well, no one could ever be elected president like that. 36 years old, who's just been on TV a lot. Why not? That's now possible. And so in a funny way, Trump has closed down all kinds of thriller plots. I once said that the Access Hollywood tape, in which Donald Trump talks about grabbing women by their, using an expletive that you would never repeat on a WJR fundraising session like this, you could have made a thriller plot out of that tape. The whole plot could have been constructed around the idea that one side want the tape to reveal it and the other side have to keep the tape secret. That would have given you a page turner, because everyone would have believed that, of course, if a tape like that ever got out, that person's career would be over. Of course, they would never be elected president. Trump has upended that. Now, we know you can get away with pretty well anything. So what's the thriller writer to do? It's been really bad. He's been bad for business in many key ways, but in one good way is that he's now opened up entirely the range of possibilities, because there is, you know, this very telegenic, very photogenic, almost aristocratic woman. She comes from, you know, her roots are in she hails from a family that is an East Coast elite family. She's almost posh in American terms, but young and completely inexperienced. Why not? Trump did it. Why couldn't she do it? And so she was based really on the sudden freedom I had rather than any existing politician.
So that is Trump's gift to you, Jonathan, was Natasha, the character Natasha.
That's right.
And this is, I suppose, a terribly obvious segue, but how are you finding reporting Trump right now? And I ask that, I suppose, you know, from the perspective of a Guardian journalist. You don't particularly have to be impartial. You're a columnist. You've presumably made your mind up, or are you still reading stuff that could convince you otherwise? I'm sort of genuinely fascinated by how open you feel you have to be at this point in the electoral cycle.
Open to the merits of Donald Trump, or open to the possibility he could win?
No, open to anything changing your mind or correcting the leaning that you might have in your writing.
Yes. So I think I'm probably, and it's very challenging, your question. Before the call started, we were joking about whether you were going to go full Prince Andrew on me. That is definitely not the Prince Andrew question, but it's a challenging question, because I think probably I haven't been fully open-minded, and most of the time with Trump, that's been fine. And if anything, actually, the people who were open-minded on him in the first wave really got it wrong. And you know, there were people who said he'll be tempered and moderate once he's the nominee. He'll be moderate and tempered once he's the president-elect. No, don't worry, he'll stop tweeting once he's actually the president. And throughout that, I was saying, no, he's this, and he's not going to change. And if he's elected, it will be this list of horrors. And I feel I've been sort of vindicated on that. But it is right to be open in I think a couple of ways. The first one is that sometimes, because he is such a maverick, he can almost stumble, you would think, into doing the right thing. And I think it's quite hard to see when he's done that. But for example, his reticence about going to war, you know, you see that in the John Bolton book that's just come out, that Bolton was banging the table, urging him to, you know, bomb Iran. And Trump, for his own, you know, reasons, didn't want to do that. So and he was right not to do that. So sometimes he can land in the right place. But where I think your word is an important sort of prod is to be open to why other people have rallied to Donald Trump. And that is where I think, you know, journalists, and I include myself, were not open enough to realizing the appeal of him. And I think we got it by the end of the campaign, but it did take some time to realize that something like that Access Hollywood tape, every instinct in you assumes that would finish off somebody like that. How could, for example, women in America vote for a man like that? And yet they did. And, you know, he did really well among white women in America. He didn't do, you know, Hillary Clinton needed to do much, much better to win, and she didn't. Why was that? And there is something very deep about his appeal. There is something almost visceral about his rule breaking that speaks to people who have lost faith in the rules. And that has really worked for him for nearly 3 years, but I think it's run out of road with coronavirus. But, well, you know, it's not over yet. But I think you're right to urge people like me into, you know, caution that we do always need to keep an open mind on that.
I'm genuinely not urging. I'm frankly curious. And one of the things that I'm curious about is that and I say this as somebody who's reporting at the same time, we found a sort of euphemistic shorthand. We used words like left behind, you know, the communities that were left behind, as if somehow it was the fault of generations and industry and the economics of the time that had landed Trump in power. And I wonder if 4 years on, you think that was an honest enough assessment, knowing as we do that actually most of the poorest people in America didn't vote for Trump. It was actually, you know, a lot of small business people did, and self-starters, and it was a different sect.
Correct.
So what I'm asking is whether how you look at the voters who came to Trump now. Were they really left behind, or was he sort of the bad boy that they just couldn't get enough of?
I was quite impatient with the left behind analysis, because I always thought it sort of put the blame in the wrong place. The reason why Donald Trump won wasn't, it wasn't chiefly because of people in shuttered post-industrial steel towns in Michigan and Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, though it was very tempting to latch onto that. The chief reason he won was Republicans voted for him in huge, huge numbers. Yes, some Democrats moved across, but what should have happened in a way, if this left behind analysis is right, is a whole lot of suburban, affluent, college-educated Republicans should have recoiled at such a person and said, he's obviously manifestly unfit to be president, and we're going to move. And why was there never heat on them? The people with the two-car garage and the lovely lawns and everything else, who were not appalled by the sheer crudity, misogyny, racism of this man. Instead, people latched onto a particular demographic who had actually voted back and forth, Republican, Democrat, at different times, and sort of made it seem to be about them. It was quite true that and so this idea of always focusing on the phrase, you'll remember, became, economic anxiety, that was the sort of code, when really very often the appeal of him was, white nationalism and racism. And that was the sort of dog whistle, and it wasn't even a dog whistle, it was very clear. And it was understood by a lot of people, whether they were, some of them poorer and some of them better off. And that was where a lot of the appeal was located, I think.
Let me ask you that then, very straight. It's a curious dilemma, and it happens here as well, that people blame the leader for using racist language, but they would never blame those who vote for them for being racist. So I guess the straight question is, would you come out and say, actually, yes, people who liked Donald Trump's racist language were probably racist themselves? Or should we stick to some form of understanding, which is the leader might be racist, but the people who vote for him are just misled? How are you comfortable?
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because it's quite true that journalistically, it's a sort of taboo to actually ever criticize the voters. And politicians don't do it either. I suppose I would say that those, in a society like America, you're there all the time reporting on it. We've both reported on it a lot. The demons of America's past are so obviously present and there. The only question is whether you speak to the better angels, or do you speak to those demons? And that there is enough of a history of racial resentment and antagonism and tension in the country, I think is obvious. I don't think you can contest that. The question is, do you stir that, provoke that, poke at it for your own political gain, or do you try and heal that? And so that's why the charge very quickly goes, I think, to the leader rather than the people who are led, because we know that's there. The question is, do you play to that? Now, I think it's an interesting point you make. A braver analysis would be to take issue with those voters, and I think it's legitimate to do that. I think some of the sort of reporting should do that rather than always trying to look for the explanation. And I think, look, in a funny way, Hillary Clinton never found a way to talk about that. And if you think about that terrible basket of deplorables,
fell into her own trap, really.
She fell into that because she seemed to be blaming them and using this very pejorative term of deplorables. And you then contrast that with, say, how Obama dealt with the famous Jeremiah Wright speech, where he was accused of being a congregant of an anti-white preacher in the form of Jeremiah Wright. Obama then did manage to take issue with not just leaders, but people themselves, and all the angst and prejudices he probably used the language of fears rather than hatred. But that, you know, if you start admitting that a whole lot of the American electorate, and I think that, and just to come tiny bit back to the book here, I think it's very gendered this as well. Donald Trump's appeal, and I actually have a character articulate this in the book To Kill the President, was very specifically to a kind of white man who he was addressing, saying, you used to be on top. Just the fact you were white and male meant that you could go to the movies when you were a kid, and you'd watch cowboy and Indian films, and John Wayne was on a horse, and the assumption was the fact that you were the white man meant you were top dog. And if there was a woman, she was second, and if there was a black man, he was third, and if there was a gay man, well, he was fourth. You know, and I put it in the book actually more crudely than that, but that was the inheritance that somebody like Donald Trump in his 70s believed was his inalienable right as a white man. And that kind of, he was speaking very directly to that sentiment in those voters. And I think you still see it in those crowds. They love him because he's saying, of course we should be able to go anywhere we like without a mask on. We're not some, you know, limp-wristed, granola-eating Whole Foods customer from New York. You're a white guy from Texas. You should be able to do what the hell you like. And that is incredibly psychologically appealing to a group of people who for decades feel as if they've been told, had a sort of wagging finger. And one of the most fascinating bits of focus group research that came out about Hillary Clinton was they saw Hillary Clinton as a first wife. They saw Hillary Clinton as a new boss who had been imposed with a whole lot of new edicts, wagging her finger, telling them, you're no longer allowed to pin up, you know, the naked women calendar in the garage. That's not allowed anymore. And Trump came along to say, every one of those things you used to do, eating red meat, smoking in the office, you can do all of those with me. And he knew how to say that. And it spoke to a very deep-seated sort of angst and resentment of a demographic he understood absolutely intuitively, and they understood him.
I think the moment that sort of clinched that for me, the absolute culture shock sort of smash, was I don't know if you remember the Iowa caucus 4 years ago, and Iowa always falls on the night of the Super Bowl. And at halftime, which is a big moment, the American Super Bowl halftime, it was Beyonce, and she sang Lemonade. And it was a song by a very, very ballsy Black woman about race. And it was almost the moment where you just got the two sides going, we love this, we hate this. And it sort of seemed to crystallize what we now sort of understand to be the culture war of, do we want progress or do we want something that feels conserved? You touched on something really interesting, which is the masks, the macho sort of side of things. And don't know if you read, there was quite an interesting piece in Unheard this week by Freddie Sayers, and he says that Trump can very much bring this back, and the way he can bring this back is, however he is deemed to have dealt with coronavirus from a scientific perspective, he manages to basically shift the blame onto the Democrats for wanting lockdown, for wanting to be prissy, for wanting to wear the mask, for wanting to stay home. And he then becomes, if you like, the savior of America's economy, the person who comes along and reopens and turbocharges and boots it up. Can you see a successful re-election along those lines?
Well, yes, if it worked, and if suddenly the economy did come roaring back and people didn't, if you had avoided a second wave, but the numbers look so bad, don't they, in terms of actual health, that you've got 7 or 8 states where it is surging actually upward, and they are in the states that did not observe lockdown, and they are the most defiant states, you know, Oklahoma and others, where they have said, well, you know, we're not these sort of, you know, limp-wristed folk in the liberal states, in the blue states, we're going to do our own thing, and it didn't work. No, I think he believed that. He believed that he would make this one more culture war, one more appeal to that machismo, that rule-breaking machismo, and he could do it again. And there's a few reasons why that's not going to happen. First, Americans are getting sick. Second, the most vulnerable group is the group that he needed and could appeal to last time, especially with that appeal to nostalgia, to 1950s John Wayne nostalgia. And I'm talking about older people. They were crucial for his election in 2016 because a lot of them, particularly men again, were of his age and liked that talk of, we'll go back to the 1950s, woman at home, 3 wives if you want them, trade her in for a younger model, your top dog. They liked all that. That group is the most vulnerable. They're the ones who are dying or getting sick. And crucially, they now have an alternative they're comfortable with. Joe Biden is another white guy in his 70s. So that the uniqueness of the appeal of Donald Trump when he was saying, I'm not Obama, that young black fella that you kind of, you know, you told your children you were okay with, but between you and me, you thought was never really American. That was hence the birther conspiracy. And nor am I some finger-wagging woman like that woman, Hillary Clinton. Instead, so that was how he was able to get a lot of those votes, because those two personalities, personas, Obama and Hillary Clinton, were repellent to a section of the electorate. Now they're comfortable. With Joe Biden, they don't need to go to Trump. So that particular type who may have had all those feelings, who have been alarmed by watching their president say, inject yourself with bleach, and you know, sending in you know, the troops against American citizens. They're worried about that. They've now got a palatable alternative. So I'm not saying that the really deep sort of nostalgic sexism and racism that propelled Trump to the White House in 2016 has gone. I'm just saying that now it can recede because they can still hold those attitudes in a way and go for Joe Biden. And I think that just enough of those, 2 or 3% of those, need to move and Biden wins.
I'm going to hand over to our viewers' questions in 1 minute, but obviously I've still got like 17,000 questions for you, Jonathan. I'm going to narrow it down to the last one. Does Biden excite you as a potential winner? And would you miss Trump if he went as a journalist?
Such good questions. I would, Biden, I find the man, it's very hard to feel excited by Joe Biden. I remember what it felt like to have, you know, Obama in 2007-8. That was genuinely a phenomenon and it was exciting. That said, I find the possibility of winning that Biden conveys to me more exciting than any number of charismatic, rabble-rousing, performative candidates. So I would take and I watched, you know, the last trip I did before lockdown was to New Hampshire, and, you know, Bernie Sanders could, you know, fire up a crowd and it was fantastic. And Joe Biden, it was painful to watch. It was almost socially, people were doing social distancing then when they didn't have to, because there was no one near him. And he was, you know, it was so painful to watch how bad he was. And yet, you know, I think Sanders would now be on course to lose, and I think Biden is on course, very probably, very possibly, to win. We don't know yet. Lots can happen between now and November. And that alone I find thrilling, because I think it will be so much better for our world, not just for America. That said, I know what you mean about Trump, and what are we going to do all day? I mean, we are going to be like junkies coming down from a 4-year sort of heroin cycle, where we have just been on journalistic, to mix my drug metaphor, journalistic sort of crack cocaine. I mean, it's been the sort of stories that would happen once every 3 or 4 years happen weekly, and stories that would happen, you know, annually now happen daily. And that is largely down to Donald Trump. He is a phenomenon. I have a feeling that people like me might end up writing about Trump in one form or other for the rest of our working lives. I mean, the aftershocks are going to be so great. When it's all over, I can imagine us all taking a deep breath and looking around to each other and going, did that really happen? Because, you know, we will have got used to a way of being that I think if it's Biden, he will go right back. I mean, he just won't be like that, because he'll be surrounded by all the Obama people who won't let him tweet, and it will be no drama, Obama too, you know.
Yeah, it'd be sort of bottom in Midsummer Night's Dream, waking up, scratching our head.
Was it all a dream? Yeah.
Yeah, was it all a dream? Right, I'm going to see if I can manfully, is that the word? Good, right, I've got some Q&As, some questions here. So let me just go with the first one. I'm reading them as I read them out.
Yes.
Following on from your last book, To Kill the Truth, which deals with the conspiracy to expunge historical records for political purposes, That's brilliant. What are Jonathan's views about the dismantling of the statues, Cecil Rhodes, Edward Colton, and others?
So, very interesting question. To kill the truth, and so let me just say a tiny preamble to that, which is Philip Pullman has this weird, almost superstitious belief that if you write something, if somebody writes it somewhere, it will happen. And To Kill the President was a weird experience for me because I wrote that before Trump took the oath of office. And in it, the first chapters, he has a nuclear standoff with North Korea. He appoints as his defense secretary a general. He appoints as his chief of staff a general. The two of them, it turns out, were in uniform together, all of which then did happen, right? With North Korea and Trump and John Kelly and Jim Mattis in the White House. So it was a kind of uncanny feeling. To Kill the Truth came out in 2019 and opens with a whole war on statues. And so it is getting a little bit sort of unnerving because I'm thinking of the Philip Pullman thing now, because that is indeed how things have panned out. My view is I don't think you can really, the statues are not holy, and they are very often not relics of the time depicted, but of a later time. So, for example, all the Confederate statues didn't go up during the time of the Civil War in America. They went up in this very strange period in the 50, 60, and in some cases 100 years later, when a kind of resurgent, actually has to be said again, a white racist movement in the South wanted to rewrite the history and turn the war to maintain slavery as to some heroic lost cause. And so there were all these fundraising campaigns to put up statues to Robert E. Lee and others then. So the period you're memorializing isn't necessarily the period of the person on the plinth. And therefore, they become a bit less sacred, I think. And so I don't think there was any justification for Edward Colston to be there. And it reflects very badly on the city of Bristol that they just hadn't got it together to either not only get it down, but to get a plaque up contextualizing it and saying, this guy was not just a philanthropist, but a slave owner. But all that said, my terrible worry about it was that I think it's a diversion from the much more pertinent issues raised by Black Lives Matter, which are about policing and discrimination and Black, Asian minority ethnic people dying from COVID at 4 times the rate of white people, and institutional discrimination in education and employment. That's what needed to be talked about. And so I noticed that, the American media 3 weeks after George Floyd were talking about the chokehold and whether or not police forces should be able to use the chokehold. And here we were talking about Churchill, and the chokehold in that moment was more pressing than Churchill. And we had got ourselves onto a topic, which I think if you're Boris Johnson or you're the commissioner of the Metropolitan Police, you're way more comfortable talking about statues and the British Library and the V&A and all these lovely sort of elite Radio 4 topics. That is much easier to talk about that than stop and search and deaths in custody. So I think, people in my sort of universe of The Guardian and the left, I think we missed a trick there because we allowed this change of subject away from a subject where those in charge would really be on the defensive, policing and racism, and instead got them onto their comfort zone, which is the Daily Telegraph want to be there talking about Churchill. They love that. That's great for them. And I think that was a huge tactical, strategic error. And I've been very struck by the fact that I don't think movements elsewhere in France and America made the same mistake.
I've got a few more questions to get through, so I'm going to crack on. This also from an anonymous attendee. Is it possible that Trump is now the model for politicians in the future for all time? Politicians have wanted to speak directly to the people without having to go through the filter of journalists. If Trump achieved that, are other politicians going to follow it because it appears to work?
Yeah, I mean, that is, so there's a danger that people have talked about, which is what if we were to get a new Trump who was just better at it and more competent? That one of the things that has helped us with Trump is that he's not been able to implement and do all the stuff he would like to do because he's not really understood the political machine. He's not a good operator of the federal government, for example, as a bureaucracy. He hasn't learned how to use it. And what if a politician came along who had all those skills and was a populist And that would be worrying. And I think other politicians are in some ways following that lead. And you see, you know, with Boris Johnson, funnily enough, about Churchill and statues, did a Twitter storm, which was a kind of Trumpian tactic. He hadn't done it before, where exactly as the questioner says, he went over the heads of the media and tweeted directly his defense of Churchill. So I think, of course, someone could do that. The thing that has so far been a kind of consolation to me, and it may be mistaken, is that I think I cannot imagine somebody doing it as well as him. His personality is so monstrous and so sort of outsized that I think if someone with less of that, you know, naked and I think, you know, distasteful charisma, it would be very hard to do. So, for example, when people say, you know, if Trump was impeached, oh, it would be no much better because we'd get Mike Pence. I always say, yeah, but Mike Pence would be fine because he just would have nothing of the power that Trump has, the charismatic, dangerous power that Trump has. You know, so look, somebody else could come along and try that. But I think, you know, a template has been, by breaking the existing template, Trump has created a new one, and that is a danger.
I'm going to bring in a couple of questions together on the same sort of theme. Excuse me. David Harrison says, Jonathan, you were an excellent and perceptive commentator on Brexit. What's your view on the current position with transition and likely deal? And Anne and Mike say, what advice would you give our government in our dealings with the Trump administration for a trade deal? Do we really need one on their terms? Do you want to sort of throw us forward to whatever that
Sure.
looks
well,
like?
That's very kind to that remark, and thank you for that. I would say that on the second point, huge naivety in the British political machine here about a trade deal with Trump. First of all, assuming there'll be any kind of special favors, special relationship, front of the queue, grotesquely naive. Trump would only ever do what he wants to do. Second naivety is to think you could get something in time. Even when Brexit happened, I thought to myself, that is going to be something that would happen in a Trump second term, God forbid, but after 2020. The idea that you're going to get that between now and November, not going to happen. And the reason I say that is relates to the third point, which is the naivety and sort of ignorance, really, which is you cannot do a trade deal with Trump alone. Any treaty like that, a free trade agreement, has to be ratified by Congress. And as soon as the House of Representatives changed hands in 2018, you had a whole new ball game, because Nancy Pelosi and the Democrats are not just going to sign up to any deal that Trump does. And Nancy Pelosi explicitly said, anything which changes or imperils the Good Friday Agreement, I won't vote for. And so this idea that you could just send Michael Gove over and, you know, or whoever it was, Liam Fox, and they would quickly ink a deal with Donald Trump and you could just click your fingers and it would be done. Wrong. It has to go through the entire Washington system, and that could be under new management by November, and half of it already is under new management because the House of Representatives is not there. As for Brexit, I was one of those people who did hold out, that I thought, oh, coronavirus, they've now got an excuse not to seek a transition and, you know, not jump out of the EU arrangements in December 31st. They have got the justification to do that. The glum prospect instead is that Dominic Cummings thinks the opposite and thinks we can hide the damage a no-deal exit would do under cover of coronavirus. My colleague Marina Hyde brilliantly put it, saying that this government approaches the prospect of a no-deal Brexit in the era of coronavirus with the sweaty gratitude of a murderer who watches the warehouse burn, knowing that there is a corpse hidden in the storage facility that nobody now will ever find. And, you know, it's brilliant from Marina, but it makes the point that they feel that their one crime may be hidden by another.
We've got time for two more questions, and I'm going to knit these ones together because they're looking at our analysis of Trump and the victory and what happens next. Nick says, is there not a fault in your analysis of Trump in that he won the Electoral College but heavily lost the popular vote? For the Democrats, it was not a failure of policy but of organisation. And Robert says, in Trump's 2016 win, a determining factor was that he ran after a two-term president of the opposite party left the White House. Only once in modern times has a party won 3 presidential elections in a row, true or false, which makes it sound, I suppose, like it was inevitable. What do you make of those thoughts?
Really interesting. I think wrong, unfortunately, to take comfort in the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote and therefore it was just organisation. That it was close enough when up against a man like Trump means it was bigger than just organisational. It's quite true that she did campaign in the wrong places. And, you know, you do feel if they'd organised that campaign better and not sent, you know, Hillary to Arizona, unwinnable, sending Michelle Obama to Arizona, I think on the second penultimate night before the election, you know, that was a mistake, shouldn't have done it. Instead, they should have focused, and as apparently Bill Clinton wanted them to do, on Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania. So there were those organizational errors, but it shouldn't even have been close, really. And so that was a sign that they had not got the message right, and people couldn't identify a clear Hillary Clinton message. You know, make America great again was very clear, cut through. What was Hillary Clinton's slogan? No one can remember. Nerds like us remember, and it was terrible. It was, I'm with her. When of course it should have been,
my website, wasn't it? Read my website, hillaryclinton.org, something like that.
Yeah, she used to say Stronger Together was one. I'm with her was one. I'm with her is, I think, one of the worst political slogans ever, because the slogan, of course, should have been, she's with you. You know, It was the wrong way round. It was an amazingly inept slogan. So that, you know, it was more than just organizational failure. It's quite true about the point that the questioner makes about 3 terms running. It is rare for that to happen. George H.W. Bush Senior, did manage to do that, succeeding Reagan after 2 terms. It is pretty rare, maybe even unprecedented. Although no, you think of Truman and Roosevelt. So no, it does happen. The problem is that for Donald Trump is that his whole campaign, more than campaign, his whole politics are those of the challenger. He's always running against the system, the government, the establishment, the deep state, the elites. You can do that as a strong challenger. You cannot do it as an incumbent. He now runs the government. And therefore, to constantly say, I don't take responsibility, like he said about coronavirus, you know, that wasn't me, that was other people, doesn't wash. Not when you're the president, not when people have been raised on decades and decades of movies where the president presses the button and it says the buck stops here. That's part of American cultural mythology now, that the president is the person in charge. And he now has he does not know how to adapt his message. You can see in rallies he's quite flailing to come up with a message as an incumbent. Very, very difficult, much harder. And that's another reason I think he, you know, will be fearful of his chances in November. That said, he has turned the world upside down before, and he may do it again.
And there's lots of really good questions. We haven't got on more to Black Lives Matter. There's more questions for Jonathan on that. Also, the dismissal of Rebecca Long Bailey, does that draw a line under Labour Party anti-Semitism? What I can say is watch this space, because I think if you go to Jonathan's column tomorrow, you might find a whole thought on the Labour Party and anti-Semitism from him there. But we're going to draw this to a close. This is the book, in case you want to see it again, To Kill a Man, Sam Bourne, Jonathan Freedland. And the COVID-19 Emergency Fund can be found at worldjewishrelief.org. But we are so happy that you joined us. It absolutely flew past for me. So I hope that you stayed with us and enjoyed. And a huge thank you to Jonathan for just, I sort of felt like I wanted to write down every sentence you said.
Thanks so much, Emily. Thank you. Thanks very much.